Thank you so much, Laura, for joining me. I really appreciate it, and you taking the time and of your this evening to just come and have a good chat with me. So I really, really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Well, without further ado, we've got to talk about, your incredible book. So, Laura Kate Dell has worked as a full-time video game critic for the past 7 years, writing for Polygon, IGN, Kotaku UK, Destructoid, and a whole bunch of other outlets. Her previous published books include the illustrated coffee book, I think it's called coffee table book called Things I Learned from Mario's Butt. I have to get that correct. Around the educational value of assessing video game characters' buttocks, which I think is hilarious. We're talking about her book Gender Euphoria, which is an anthology of positive, real-world stories from trans writers. So extremely important subject. And I noticed it was written sort of was it in 2020 when you wrote it?
Yes, so I'd wanted to write a book like this for quite a long time, and it's one of those projects that it had been bouncing around for a while. I'd been trying to find a publisher that I could properly pay contributors because that was important for getting off the ground. But the spring and summer of 2020 really sort of got a bit of a kick up the backside to start working on it. Yeah, it was in part because, during 2020, there was a bit of an upswell in negative coverage of the trans community by media publications. It had been a thing for a while, but in 2020, it seemed to really step up. You saw a lot of previously, I would have called them progressive British media institutions suddenly taking a turn and like platforming a lot of like very vocal anti-trans voices very uncritically. But that came at the same time as obviously we started encroaching into a global pandemic and people not like in any other year, I'd have had pride events to go to. I'd have had things throughout the summer to feel a sense of community, a sense of camaraderie, a sense of connection with the trans community and the rest of the queer community in general. But without that, I felt very isolated and like I needed something to immerse myself in some positivity. And working on this book seemed like as good an excuse as any to collect a bunch of joy and positivity together.
That's really lovely. And actually, I can totally see how that could help because exactly everyone was remote and it was really hard. And I do wonder, I'm like, just for our viewers, is it okay for you to just describe what gender dysphoria is exactly so
Of
that we
course.
understand what euphoria is?
So, gender dysphoria is a term that is often associated with a medical diagnosis that is a deep discomfort with a person's biologically assigned gender or sex. To give myself as an example, when I was born, doctors decided I was male, and I had a lot of areas of my life in which that caused me to feel deeply uncomfortable. A good example from my own life is when I started going through puberty. My voice got much lower, and it felt very alien to me. I felt like someone else's voice was in coming out of me. It was upsetting and concerning. That was an experience of gender dysphoria. It was an experience of the way that my body was and the way that I felt not lining up in a way that was very distressing.
That definitely came across with the stories and things that was mentioned in the anthology, and it's just so harrowing to read as well. And I had to ask, like, what did it feel like to write your own stories in there? Because I guess when you're collecting lots of other people's stories, there's a level of distance in a way, but when you're writing your own, what did it feel like to do that?
Um, Writing stories for Gender Euphoria was a very positive process. The first published book I ever did was a book called Uncomfortable Labels, which was a sort of memoir written about growing up at the intersection of being both trans and autistic. And a lot of what I talked about in that book was the things that I struggled with, because during the early years of transition, struggle was a big part of my day to day. There was a lot of aspects of transition that were about trying to escape from discomfort that I was going through at the time. But Gender Euphoria as a book was completely different because once I'd sort of gotten that bit of story told, I had room to go, you know what? Day to day, most of the time, my experience of being a trans person is very joyous. I am very much focused on the happiness that I get to experience being who I am rather than thinking about trying to avoid discomfort and giving myself space to just sit and try and write stories that were about joy and positivity and to really appreciate the things that I liked about my own life story was really, it felt very healthy. I think that taking time to think about where your sources of joy are and how to explain the things that make you happy to other people is something that is really worth putting time into.
That's so lovely. And yeah, no, I totally understand that because you kind of went through a cathartic process, isn't it, with the first book, and then you got to read so many like beautiful stories of joy, as you said. And exactly, so you mentioned in the book that like it took like there were hundreds of stories that you had to pick from.
Mm.
So how did you actually go about like compiling them and picking them?
Yeah, there was something like, I think about 1,200 emails that I had to work through. And condensing that down to, I think in the end we had 18 contributors outside of myself, was certainly not an easy process. There was a lot of wonderful stories that had to be left on the table, but there was a couple of things I wanted to balance. First and foremost, something really important to me was making sure that the stories that were told were not just from one perspective and trying to be aware of the kinds of stories of transition that tend to get told and that tend to get platformed and making an effort to not have that be all that this anthology would be. Usually when you read stories of transition, it's from white, usually trans women, usually from the United Kingdom or the United States. Very few places outside of that. Usually you don't read stories from people, say, with disabilities or with overlapping other situations in their life. And I wanted to make sure that not only did I have a collection of stories that were all distinct in the topics they covered and covered as much of, overlapped as little as possible, but that told stories from parts of the world where often trans experiences are not signal boosted as much, and trying to make sure that I didn't fall into the trap of how I've experienced trans joy being the way that I presented it in this book and trying to go, there are other people who have other experiences, and it's important to give a sort of full context of what that joy can be.
No, and I definitely saw that because they were like the story from I think Brazil and it was
Mm.
really great to hear how it is in different countries and also I really appreciated the spectrum of sort of transition stories. It was such a like a wide variety, which was great. And I was wondering for you, was there anything that really any particular story that like really struck a chord, do you think, outside of your own story?
Depending on what day you ask me this question, I would give you a different answer. There's so many stories that depending on the day you catch me, but one that jumps to mind right now, and I think it might be the first story at the start of the book, is by an author called Miles Nelson, who tells a story of him and his husband getting married and trying to make sure that their wedding day could be as gender affirming as possible, despite some of the hurdles that were placed in front of them. And that's a story that I think about a lot, in that it's a story that doesn't shy away from the fact that there are some difficulties and hurdles that existed, but was able to go, those didn't stop us finding joy that looked the way it does for us. And that story really, I love that one a lot.
Yeah, it was so lovely just to have that moment where they were able to just sort of go away and just do their own bit, I think, and that was great without like anyone else, which I thought was really nice. And also I was wondering, you know, because of course, we hear this term of like dysphoria all the time, and I'm just wondering, why do you think we all only ever kind of focus on the dysphoria side rather than the euphoria side?
I think there's a few reasons for this. I think part of it is tied up in the fact that gender dysphoria is a diagnostic term that is often a prerequisite to people being able to get the medical help they need as a trans person. And uh, just because in order to get help, you have to talk about your story in terms of suffering, that inevitably flavors the way that trans people have to think about and talk about our own experiences. I think part of it is because it's easier to explain to an outside audience who are not trans, I am struggling with something, it is causing me distress and harm, and I need intervention to help fix that, is an easier sell to someone who might not necessarily be on board with trans people's existence than I am happier and more positive when I have, when I live like this. That, as sad as it is, there's a lot of people who will listen to someone say, this just makes me happier, and will hear that as, oh, you're just doing this for some kind of perverse joy. Whereas, talking about the suffering that does happen that we're trying to get away from is harder for groups to twist against us. Part of it is to do with the fact that we are still living in a world that very much treats trans status the way that being gay was treated maybe 30 or 40 years ago, where it is treated as a mental health condition and not normalized to the point where, you can just talk about, this is just who I am and that makes me happy, and people don't need to start grilling you with questions about why that's the case. And all of these things come together, particularly when paired with a world that is pushing to take away trans rights as much as they are right now, to make it hard to find space to think about joy. I think that when you are someone who has to, on a daily basis, read about which institution, which politician, which celebrity has now decided that taking away your rights is the biggest thing they want to focus on, it can be hard to think about your own joy because you feel like you're in fight or flight mode constantly. Like the day before we're recording this interview, Donald Trump made a video talking about the fact that day one, if he gets re-elected into office, he is going to ban all gender transition for all people of all ages in the United States. When you've got things like that going on, it's hard to take the time to appreciate the joy you're feeling when it feels like you have to be on the defense constantly. I think I realize that's a slightly lengthy answer, but I think it gets to it.
No, no, I totally agree, and I totally understand, the fears around that as well. And exactly. So in the space of all of this happening and all of this sort of awfulness that's happening, how do you carve out a little bit of joy for yourself within that, especially within the trans community? What do you think is the best thing?
I think for me, and I can't speak for any of the other wonderful contributors in the book, but I think for me, it was about appreciating the small moments and giving myself permission to find the joy in small moments and to not feel self-conscious about the fact that something that might not feel like a big deal to someone else could be very important to me, and that's okay. I think about, I had a very recent example. It's not one that's in the book, but I go swimming on a weekly basis with my wife, and changing rooms can be a very anxious experience as a trans person. I'm never sure if someone's going to decide that today's the day that they have a problem with me being in the space I'm in. But over the past few weeks and months, there's a regular who goes swimming the same day as we do, who we sometimes talk to in the changing room and we're on friendly terms with. And that wouldn't necessarily be a big deal to anyone else, but it's something that I've recently been trying to take the time to be like, it's okay that it feels like a really positive big deal to me that there is a friendly face who doesn't question my presence, who I feel like if anything were to go wrong would have my back, and that sense of camaraderie has allowed me to feel less anxious about an activity that I love doing with my wife. And it's things like that. It's noticing those small moments of this might not be a big deal to anyone else, but it's a big deal to me, and it's okay to hold on to that and to appreciate that for what it is.
And that's what it's all about, isn't it? It is the personal moments to you, because it's different for everyone, as you mentioned, and it's so true. And oh, it's true actually, especially now. God, we're all going through something, aren't we?
Yeah.
So it's a heck of a time. But in the midst of all of this, we go on to your new book, which obviously is Who Hunts the Whale, which was obviously written with Jane Erith Magnet. I hope I pronounced that correctly.
Yep.
But and who is your partner, which is fantastic, and your wife. So what is the premise of the book exactly, just so that we can
So as you sort of alluded to earlier, I write a lot of different books in a lot of different styles, and some of them are more serious and more silly than others. But this is my first full-length novel. I've written fiction before, but only illustrated children's fiction. But this is a novel that myself and my wife wrote about a woman who gets a job working at a big budget video game development company and follows a year of her learning about the realities of the business side of how video games are made, and that behind the products as art that she loves, there is a lot of corporate mismanagement and poor treatment of workers, and trying to work out what she can do to lessen the harm done to the people creating the art she loves. It is at times a bit silly and exaggerated, but at times it's also quite a serious look at the real world video game industry and the problems that have been becoming more and more prominent in that industry as the search for profit has very much harmed the people working on these games.
because I actually read the book, and so I was very excited to read it because exactly, I'm like, I hear so much about sort of the sexism side of how bad it is in the video game industry. So I had to ask, like, how much of this was sort of biographical or taken elements from reality into this book exactly?
Most of the things that turn up in this book are based on a degree of real world examples, and some of them are a bit more exaggerated than others. But this is an interesting conversation. It's a conversation we had to have with the editor of the book at one point, who was not particularly up to speed on video games. And there were a few points in that book where we would get editing notes that were like, this feels a little bit unrealistic. Are you sure you should include something this unrealistic? And I would send some links and go, oh no, that's really not that exaggerated. We took that from this news story that happened last year. There's a good example that I don't think is too spoilery is there's a point in that book where they travel to a game development conference and there is a talk being given about monetization methods in video games. A lot of stuff in that talk is lifted wholesale from a real talk that happened a few years ago where someone was just very openly talking about the psychological manipulation they were going to use to get money out of people. It's a book that the way we went about the book tried to be as much as possible. If someone reads a section and goes, maybe tweets us and goes, that seems a little bit unrealistic, we can send them a link and go, it's really not that unrealistic. Here's something to read about. And that it would be a jumping on point for people who had questions to learn more about the real world things that sort of inspired the events in it.
Yeah, I'm like, it is shocking because you're right. You do read about all these really terrible things that have happened. And I think there was a bit in it, without saying too much, of course, but about basically essentially copying bits from other
Yeah,
places and
yeah,
from smaller developers and stuff. And it's like, oh God, I
yeah,
think I've seen that happen and stuff like that. And it's
yeah.
just like, Oh God. But I think this there's some real, I think it hasn't really been talked about very much in books. And do you feel that's the case as well?
I think a lot of it has been talked about in some wonderful books by people like there's an author called Jason Schreier who's done some fantastic work in this. But a lot of the books that are out there are very dry clinical accounts of real world events that happened. And while that is incredibly valuable, I've read those books and taken a lot away, and they've been very informative. A lot of people will not read a book like that. There's a lot of people who will not pick up a book that they know is just going to be start to finish. Here is a very lengthy series of accounts of some real things that happened in the real world that are very depressing. And what I think sets our book apart is trying to create a narrative and relatable named characters that we can use to sort of introduce people little by little in to then when we eventually get into some of the heavier stuff going, we got you through the door, now pay attention to what's happening because some of this stuff is really bad.
Yeah, and I definitely saw that because even the character, the main character, it seems like that for that person as well, where they're just sort of like easing into this like really quite brutal world. And I just before we go, I had to ask, it's like, did you feel like you experienced any of that sort of stuff personally when you were in that industry? And are you still in the industry now?
I still make content around video games. I Some of it is definitely stuff that I've experienced to degrees myself. A lot of the content in that book that talks about like being a woman in video games on the internet comes from personal experience. I have had my fair share of angry nerd men deciding that they don't want me in their industry and being very loud and vocal about that. I have experienced some of the more horrible things that people on the internet can try and do to impact your real life. And a lot of the content in the book that centers around the journalist and their feeling quite disheartened by trying to love video games as art. A lot of that comes from my own experiences in the industry.
Yeah, yeah, that makes total sense because at the end of the day, you're also a consumer and you love it, and it's really hard to suddenly separate yourself whilst you're also
Yeah,
dealing with the worst of it.
that's the thing that pushed me to want to write this book with Jane was that I love video games as an artistic medium, but it is hard to love them when your job involves having to, on a basically weekly basis, read about which company has done which terrible thing to its employees this week, and particularly reporting on those kinds of terrible things happening, and then having to watch, you know, some big company just completely pretend the bad stories didn't happen the second there's a new game they're excited about. It's really tiring. It's really tiring to feel like no one seems to care about the things that are going on. And this book was definitely an outlet for that frustration.
Yeah, I totally can sympathize with that. I've been in a tech company
Ooh.
before, so I can definitely empathize with that feeling as well. So yeah, Laura, like really appreciate it. It was both books are excellent, and it's weirdly different and yet also in the same vein in many ways as well. So really appreciate you speaking with me today as well about both your books. So I hope you come back at some point with your next book as well.
I'm sure that, well, I was going to say, I'm sure there'll be more of them. I know there's more. I've just finished writing another.
Oh, wow. Gosh,
Just can't
good.
stop writing them.
It's a good outlet for sure. And you're clearly very good at it. So, yeah,
Thank you.
fantastic. Well, again, huge thanks for joining me, Laura. I really, really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.